My name is Pauline Mercer. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I was known as a dependable woman, someone who kept things together quietly. I was a wife, a professional, a steady presence in rooms where stability was valued more than truth. I lived a life that looked complete from the outside, not extraordinary, not dramatic, just intact. People usually describe me as calm, thoughtful, the kind of woman who doesn't overreact. I didn't press for reassurance. I didn't make discomfort visible. I learned how to smooth over pauses in conversation and let unresolved things sit without naming them. If you had known me then, you might have underestimated me. Not because I lacked awareness, but because I rarely displayed urgency. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed patterns before I ever questioned them. And I understood something very early on. People tend to reveal their true decisions long before they explain them. This story isn't about shock in the way movies portray it. There was no screaming match, no late-night confession, no dramatic confrontation at the kitchen table. My marriage ended with paperwork. The first time I learned my husband had filed for divorce was through a court notice. An envelope, typed language, deadlines, signatures. No conversation beforehand, no warning framed as concern, just a legal action that had already decided the future without my participation. That's why I titled this story the way I did. My husband filed for divorce without warning. I found out through the court notice. Because sometimes the most life-altering moments don't announce themselves emotionally, they arrive administratively. What I want to be clear about from the beginning is this. I'm not here to dramatize what happened. I'm not here to villainize my ex-husband or present myself as flawless. I'm here to tell the truth about what it feels like when something deeply personal ends without discussion, when you realize that some endings arrive without conversation. This story traces what happened before that envelope arrived and what unfolded quietly after. It's about the slow accumulation of being overlooked, the normalization of small dismissals, and the internal shift that occurs when you stop waiting for clarity from someone who has already moved on in silence. There will be no revenge arcs here, no sudden triumphs, no public reckoning. What you'll hear instead is the process of regaining authorship over my own life, not loudly, not emotionally, but deliberately. I'm sharing this for anyone who has ever been told, implicitly or explicitly, that because they are calm, they must be unaffected. For anyone who has been mistaken as passive when they were simply observant. And for those who have learned too late that being easy sometimes makes it easier for others to leave without explanation. Before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question, just to hold with you as this story begins. Have you ever realized that a decision about your life had already been made long before anyone thought to talk to you about it? For a long time, I believed I understood who I was in my marriage. I was the steady one, the background constant, the person who made life run smoothly enough that no one had to stop and examine how it was running at all. To my husband, I was dependable. That was the word he used most often when talking about me to others. Dependable like a structure that doesn't sway in the wind. Dependable like something you assume will be there tomorrow because it has always been there the day before. There was no malice in it, but there was also no curiosity. In social settings, I was introduced as the organized one, the planner, the one who remembers things. People smiled when they said it, and I smiled back. I was the wife who didn't interrupt conversations, who didn't contradict stories even when they were retold incorrectly, who didn't draw attention back to herself once it drifted away. I learned how to make myself useful without being visible. What no one seemed to notice was how thoroughly I had been edited out of the emotional center of my own life. I handled logistics, I anticipated needs, I absorbed moods. If something felt slightly off, I adjusted myself rather than asking questions. If plans changed, I adapted. If silence stretched too long, I filled it, sometimes with practical solutions, sometimes with quiet patience. Over time, this became my role. Not the person whose inner world needed tending to, but the one who made sure everything else stayed balanced. I wasn't unhappy in a way that felt dramatic enough to name. That's the part that's hardest to explain. There were no obvious red flags waving in front of me, just a gradual realization that my presence was assumed rather than engaged with. I was included, but rarely consulted. Heard, but rarely followed up on. My husband didn't treat me badly. That's what I told myself, and it was true in the narrowest sense. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't explosive, he didn't insult me, but he also didn't ask me questions that didn't have an obvious purpose. He didn't linger in conversations about how I felt unless there was a problem to solve. Emotional depth, when it appeared, was brief and quickly redirected back to something actionable. I became very good at being low friction. And because I didn't protest, because I didn't demand reassurances or initiate confrontations, a narrative quietly formed around me. Pauline is fine. Pauline can handle it. Pauline doesn't need much. What I didn't realize at the time was that this perception wasn't neutral. It was shaping how decisions were made around me. If someone is assumed to be okay with everything, they slowly stop being included in the decision-making process altogether. I see now how invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates through small omissions, through unanswered questions that never get re-asked, through emotional labor that goes unacknowledged because it's done seamlessly. I wasn't ignored in a dramatic way. I was bypassed. And the most unsettling part is that I helped maintain this image. I thought I was being mature, understanding, supportive. I believed that restraint was a form of strength, and in many ways, it was. But it also taught the people around me that my inner life was an optional context. No one woke up one day and decided I didn't need to be consulted. It simply became normal. Looking back, I can trace how easily I was categorized. I was the reliable wife, the calm presence, the one least likely to make a scene. And when you fit neatly into a role, people stop imagining you beyond it. At the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt efficient, useful, needed in a functional sense. But something essential was missing, and I hadn't yet learned how to name it. I didn't know then that this version of me, the one everyone relied on but rarely truly saw, was the foundation for what would come next. Because when the day arrived that a decision was made without me, it didn't feel completely foreign. It felt like the logical conclusion of a role I had been playing for years. The first time something shifted, it didn't feel important enough to mark. That's how these things usually begin, not with a fracture, but with a hairline crack you only notice later, once the structure has already changed. We were having dinner with friends. Nothing unusual. The conversation drifted from work to travel, then to a decision my husband and I had supposedly made together about relocating departments within his company, a move that would subtly but significantly affect our schedules. He spoke confidently, explaining the rationale, the timing, and the benefits. I listened carefully, waiting for the moment when he would say we talked about this, or Pauline and I decided. Instead, he said, "I think it's the best move." And the conversation flowed on. I remember smiling, nodding. I remember one of our friends glancing at me briefly as if to check whether I agreed. I didn't contradict him. I didn't interrupt. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, that we'd discuss it properly later. But we never did. That was the first small cut. Not because he spoke for both of us, but because he didn't even look at me while doing it. At home later that night, I considered bringing it up. I replayed the moment in my head, testing different ways of phrasing my discomfort. Each version sounded too sensitive, too minor. I convinced myself it wasn't worth creating tension over something that could easily be clarified later. Later, it became a pattern. After that, there were more moments like it. Decisions framed as conclusions rather than conversations. Plans mentioned in passing. Assumptions embedded in casual language. None of them was dramatic enough to demand confrontation. All of them were small enough to dismiss, especially by someone like me who had learned to value harmony over immediacy. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was a faint sense of being edited, as if my role had subtly shifted from participant to supporting detail. Everyone else ignored it, or maybe they didn't see it at all. From the outside, nothing was wrong. We were functional, polite, calm. We didn't argue in public. We didn't correct each other. That kind of restraint is often mistaken for health. I told myself that relationships evolve, that long-term partnerships don't require constant discussion over every detail, that trust sometimes looks like letting go. But deep down, I felt something being withdrawn quietly, incrementally. Not love exactly, agency. The unsettling part was how quickly I adapted. I learned to register these moments internally without reacting outwardly. I cataloged them, not with resentment, but with growing awareness. I began to notice how often decisions were finalized before I was informed, how often my agreement was assumed rather than requested. And still I stayed silent. Because silence had worked for me before. Because being easy had always been rewarded with stability. Because I believed that if something truly mattered, it would eventually be discussed openly. I didn't realize then that the absence of discussion was the decision. That first small cut didn't hurt because it was sharp. It hurt because it was clean, and because I let it heal without ever acknowledging it was a wound. I didn't know yet that I was training myself to accept less visibility, less authorship, less voice. I only knew that something subtle had changed and that no one else seemed to notice or mind, least of all him. What begins quietly has a way of settling into the background of your life. After the first few moments like that, small decisions made without me, assumptions spoken out loud as fact, I told myself they were exceptions, temporary lapses, the natural byproduct of familiarity. I didn't call it disrespect. That word felt too heavy, too confrontational. Instead, I framed it as efficiency, convenience. The kind of thing couples slip into when they've been together long enough to just know what the other person wants. The truth was more uncomfortable. No one was checking anymore. There were times when I would hear about plans secondhand, through his tone, through a passing comment, through an email he forgot I was copied on. Not secrets, just conclusions. And every time I had a choice: interrupt the flow and assert myself, or absorb it and move on. I absorbed it. I told myself I was being mature, that I didn't need constant validation. Making an issue out of small things was a sign of insecurity. I had always prided myself on emotional restraint, on being the person who didn't escalate, who didn't demand reassurance. So I adjusted. If he spoke for us, I let him. If he decided something and informed me afterward, I recalibrated my expectations. If my preferences were overridden, I quietly deprioritized them myself. I became efficient at minimizing my own reactions, convincing myself that flexibility was a virtue. Over time, this behavior taught everyone around me something very specific. I would adapt. And once people learn that about you, they stop worrying about how their choices land. What unsettled me most wasn't the behavior itself. It was how normal it began to feel. The way my discomfort dulled with repetition. The way I started anticipating being excluded and preemptively made peace with it before it even happened. I would notice a plan forming and think, this probably won't involve me. And when it didn't, I told myself I had already accepted it. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through consistency. There were moments when I considered speaking up. Late at night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing, I would rehearse sentences in my head. Calm ones, reasonable ones. Sentences that started with "I feel" and ended with a compromise. But morning would come, and the urgency would dissolve. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't dismissive in obvious ways. He just moved forward. And I followed, slightly behind, carrying the weight of adaptation like it was my responsibility. I started to question myself instead of the pattern. Was I expecting too much? Was this just what long-term marriage looked like? I compared myself to other women I knew. Women who argued more, demanded more, seemed perpetually dissatisfied. I told myself I was different, better even, quieter. What I didn't see yet was that my silence wasn't preserving peace. It was teaching him that my presence didn't require acknowledgement, and slowly I began to disappear from the center of my own life. I wasn't erased in one dramatic moment. I was softened around the edges, smoothed out, reduced to a role that fit comfortably into other people's plans. And because I didn't resist, the process continued unchecked. By the time I noticed how far it had gone, it already felt normal to be an afterthought. That's the danger of rationalizing what hurts you. You lose the ability to recognize it as harm. At some point, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong and started noticing how clearly defined my place had become. Not through conversation, but through repetition, through expectation. The way people interacted with me without ever checking if the role still fit. I was the reliable one, the person who would adjust her schedule without complaint, the one who would step in if something needed to be handled, the one who didn't require follow-up questions or emotional check-ins. My husband trusted that I would manage whatever landed in front of me, and that trust, I once believed, was a form of respect. Now I understand it was also a form of delegation. I handled the logistics of our shared life, bills, appointments, family coordination. I remembered things so no one else had to. I made space so others could move freely, and because I did it well, it became expected. What I didn't realize was that competence, when paired with silence, can make you invisible. No one asked how I felt about these responsibilities. They didn't need to. I never expressed hesitation. I never pushed back. I had been so consistent in my reliability that my consent was assumed by default. My husband didn't assign me this role explicitly. He didn't sit me down and outline expectations. He simply leaned into what worked. And what worked was my willingness to carry weight without asking for recognition. Over time, I noticed how rarely my needs entered the equation. Not because they were denied, but because they were never raised. When decisions were made, the underlying assumption was that I would adapt, that I always had. I wasn't seen as someone who might resist, or question, or change. I was the safe option. And safety, I learned, can become a limitation when it prevents others from imagining you as complex or autonomous. There were moments when I felt myself shrinking, not in confidence, but in presence. My opinions became footnotes. My preferences became negotiable. My emotional reactions became things I processed privately so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone else. I told myself this was a partnership, that compromise meant flexibility, that being dependable was a strength. But I was the only one compromising, and I was doing it so quietly that no one noticed it was happening. What I didn't yet understand was that roles, once established, are rarely questioned by the people who benefit from them. And the longer you play them without resistance, the harder it becomes to step outside of them without causing confusion or discomfort. I wasn't resentful, I wasn't criticized, I was categorized. And when you are categorized, people stop asking who you are now. They rely on who you have been. This role made life easier for everyone else. It reduced friction. It eliminated uncertainty. It allowed decisions to move forward smoothly. But it came at a cost. Because when the time came for a life-altering decision to be made, I wasn't seen as someone who needed to be included in the process. I was seen as someone who would adjust afterward. At the time, I didn't protest. I didn't even fully recognize the danger of this position. I just kept showing up, fulfilling expectations, maintaining the image of calm reliability that had become synonymous with my name. I didn't know yet that this role, so carefully built over years, was the reason my voice would eventually be bypassed entirely. And I certainly didn't know how close I was to the moment when silence would no longer be something imposed on me, but something I would choose. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no revelation, no moment where the world tilted dramatically on its axis. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that I almost missed it. I was alone in the house, going through a stack of mail that had accumulated on the counter. Bills, advertisements, and a few envelopes I recognized by weight and color. My husband wasn't home yet. The silence felt neutral, familiar. Then I noticed an envelope I didn't recognize. It wasn't addressed casually, no handwritten note, no logo. I immediately associated it with something routine. Just my name, printed cleanly, formally. There was something about the weight of it that made me pause. Not fear exactly, but attention. I didn't open it right away. I set it down and finished sorting the rest of the mail. That detail stands out to me now because it says something about who I was at that moment. Even faced with uncertainty, I defaulted to order, to sequence, to calm. When I finally opened it, I read the first line twice before it registered, then a third time. The language was precise, impersonal, unmistakable. My husband had filed for divorce. Not discussed, not proposed, filed. I remember sitting down, not because I felt faint, but because my body needed stillness to match what my mind was doing. There was no rush of emotion, no tears, just a deep, quiet awareness settling into place. This hadn't come out of nowhere. That was the thought that surprised me most. As I read through this document, the dates, the formalities, the legal framing of what had once been a shared life, I felt something click into alignment. All those moments I had minimized, all the assumptions I had absorbed, all the times I had been informed rather than included. This was the culmination. He hadn't left emotionally in a dramatic way. He had simply moved forward the way he always did, efficiently, decisively, without consultation. And I had been training him to do that for years. That realization didn't come with self-blame. It came with clarity. For the first time, I saw the pattern without trying to soften it, without excusing it, without asking myself how I could have been more understanding. I saw how my silence had been interpreted not as strength, but as permission. The most painful part wasn't the divorce itself. It was the absence of conversation, the understanding that my role in this decision had been reduced to compliance after the fact. Some endings arrive without conversation. I said that to myself out loud, sitting alone in that quiet house, not with bitterness, just recognition. By the time my husband came home that evening, I had already made a subtle but irreversible shift internally. Not toward anger, not toward confrontation, toward ownership. I didn't mention the envelope right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I was listening to myself, to what I felt, to what I needed next. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't rush to smooth anything over. I let the silence exist. In the days that followed, something in me remained unusually still, not numb, aware, focused, as if all the background noise that had once pulled at my attention had finally gone quiet. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't ask why. I didn't demand an explanation. And that restraint wasn't accidental. For the first time, my silence wasn't a habit or a reflex. It was a decision. When he spoke, I listened the way I always had, but differently. I noticed how his words were structured, how often he framed things as already resolved, how little space there was for dialogue, even now, especially now. He seemed almost relieved by my calm. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed and how quickly he moved through practical details. He mistook my composure for acceptance, for weakness maybe, or at least for the same adaptability he had always relied on. I didn't correct that assumption. Instead, I observed, I paid attention to what he said and what he didn't. I noticed the absence of apology, the lack of curiosity about my internal state. He explained logistics. He avoided emotion. He stayed within the realm of what could be managed and controlled. And I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood the power of timing. Silence, I learned, can be a form of withdrawal. When you stop offering emotional labor, people feel the absence before they understand it. When you stop cushioning outcomes, the consequences land more clearly. I let him believe that things were proceeding smoothly, that I was handling it the way I always did, calmly, efficiently, without resistance. Behind that calm, something else was taking shape. I began to gather information, not aggressively, methodically. I reread the documents, I took notes, I made calls I had never thought I would need to make. I asked questions, just not to him. No one noticed the shift. Why would they? From the outside, I looked the same. Quiet, reasonable, cooperative. But internally, I had stopped centering my actions around being easy to deal with. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't scheming, I was simply reclaiming my agency in the only way that made sense to me, through clarity. What surprised me most was how empowering that felt. Not exhilarating, grounding. For years, my silence had been a response to discomfort. Now it was a strategy rooted in self-respect. I no longer needed to explain myself to be valid. I no longer needed his understanding to move forward. I was no longer waiting for permission to take my own life seriously. And because no one expected this from me, I was given space to do it uninterrupted. That's the thing about being underestimated. It creates room. Room to observe. Room to prepare. Room to choose a path that doesn't require approval. In that quiet space, I began to understand something fundamental. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I needed to stop speaking to the wrong audience. And I wasn't finished yet. What they never noticed was how closely I was paying attention. Because I had always been quiet, no one questioned my stillness now. My calm had been normalized to the point where it no longer registered as behavior. It was simply who I was. And that assumption gave me an unusual advantage. While everyone else moved forward as if the situation were already settled, I slowed down. I began documenting things I had once trusted memory to hold: dates, conversations, patterns, financial details I had previously handled automatically, without scrutiny. Accounts I had managed, expenses I had absorbed, decisions I had adapted to without question. I wasn't searching for fault. I was building a complete picture of the life I had been part of and the life I was about to exit. I read everything, not emotionally, but analytically. I learned the language of process, of timelines, of implications. I asked professionals questions without framing myself as confused or distressed. I framed myself as prepared. No one saw this happening. To my husband, I was still the same Pauline. Cooperative, calm, uncomplicated. He spoke in terms of fairness, efficiency, and moving on. He assumed I would accept the structure he had already imagined, because I always had. What he didn't see was that I had stopped orienting myself around his expectations. I began to notice how much I had been carrying that had never been acknowledged as a shared responsibility. How many systems relied on my consistency. How much of the stability he moved through effortlessly had been quietly maintained by me. This wasn't a realization that fueled anger. It fueled precision. I didn't confront him with these observations. I didn't correct his assumptions. I let him continue underestimating the depth of my awareness, because for once that underestimation worked in my favor. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to be understood and start focusing on being prepared. I no longer needed validation for my feelings. I needed accuracy. So I checked facts. I confirmed timelines. I sought counsel that spoke in terms of options, not emotions. I learned what silence could protect and what it could expose. And through all of this, I remained outwardly unchanged. That's the part that still surprises people when they hear this story. They expect a visible transformation: anger, withdrawal, rebellion. But the truth is quieter than that. I didn't become someone else. I became deliberate. Every step I took was grounded in the same traits people had always seen in me: patience, observation, restraint. The difference was that this time, those traits were working exclusively for me. I was no longer managing the emotional environment. I was managing my future. And because no one thought to look for movement beneath my calm, I was given the rare privilege of preparing without interference. By the time anyone sensed that something had shifted, the groundwork was already in place. They just didn't know it yet. The private reveal didn't arrive with satisfaction. There was no surge of triumph, no moment where I leaned back and thought, so this is where the power is. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, in the middle of an ordinary weekday. I was reviewing information I had gathered: documents, summaries, notes taken during conversations that had once seemed routine. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for understanding, for accuracy, for a clear view of what was actually true beneath the assumptions I had lived with for years. And that's when I saw it. Not a secret exactly, more like an imbalance that had gone unexamined because it was inconvenient to question, a structure that had been built on my reliability, my silence, my willingness to absorb complexity so that others could move freely. The realization wasn't emotional, it was clarifying. I saw how decisions that appeared neutral had cumulative effects, how certain arrangements had favored one trajectory over another, how my flexibility had masked disparities that were never discussed because they didn't cause friction, only quiet disadvantage. This was the moment when everything sharpened. I understood very clearly that I had more agency than anyone realized, not because I had hidden something, but because I had been the one holding things together, the one who understood the systems, the one who knew how things actually functioned when no one was paying attention. What struck me most was how easily this knowledge could have been used earlier, to argue, to confront, to demand. But that wasn't what it was for now. It was a choice. For the first time since the envelope arrived, I felt grounded in something solid. Not anger, not sadness, certainty. The kind that doesn't require external affirmation. I didn't share this realization with anyone. Not friends, not family, not my husband. It wasn't a secret out of fear. It was private because it was mine. And I had learned the cost of giving people information before they had earned the right to interpret it. So I sat with it. I let the implications settle. I allowed myself to imagine different paths forward, not in emotional terms, but in practical ones. Each option carried weight. Each had consequences. And for once, I didn't rush to soften those consequences for anyone else. There was no celebration at this moment, just a quiet acknowledgement. I was no longer navigating in the dark. The story I had been telling myself, that I was behind, that I was reacting, that I was simply catching up, fell away. I wasn't late to this realization. I had arrived exactly when I was ready to use it responsibly. This private reveal didn't make me powerful overnight. It made me intentional. An intention, I would soon learn, changes everything. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That was the quiet truth sitting with me after the private reveal. Knowledge doesn't demand action immediately, but it does demand honesty. I reached a point where I had to decide what kind of ending I was willing to participate in. There were several paths available to me. I could confront him directly, present what I now understood, and force a conversation that had been avoided for years. I could express how blindsided I felt, how much it hurt to be excluded from a decision that reshaped my life. I could ask for explanations, for apologies, for reassurance that something human still existed beneath the procedure. That path was open to me. I could also do what I had always done. Adapt quietly, accept the framework already laid out, minimize disruption, and move on in a way that preserved everyone else's comfort. That option required the least resistance. It was familiar. It was expected. And then there was the third option, the one that didn't involve confrontation or compliance, the one that required me to act without needing to be seen as reasonable, agreeable, or understanding. This option wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve ultimatums or emotional displays. It involved choosing myself as the primary decision maker in my own life, for the first time in a way that couldn't be reversed. I spent time sitting with that choice. Not days of anguish, just quiet reflection. I asked myself what I would regret more, being misunderstood or continuing to live inside a role that erased me. The answer was immediate. I didn't need him to understand my decision. I didn't need his validation. I didn't even need his acknowledgement of the imbalance I had discovered. What I needed was alignment with myself. So I chose the irreversible path. Not because it was the most aggressive, but because it was the most honest. I decided that I would no longer orient my actions around preserving a version of peace that required my silence. I would move forward deliberately within the structures already in motion, but on my own terms. I would stop cushioning outcomes, stop anticipating reactions, stop translating my needs into something more palatable. This decision didn't come with adrenaline, it came with calm. Once it was made, the internal noise disappeared. I wasn't torn anymore. I wasn't rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I wasn't hoping for a different outcome. I accepted what was already true. The marriage had ended without conversation, and that meant I was free to complete the ending without seeking permission. From that point on, every action I took had a single reference point. Does this serve my future, or does it preserve someone else's comfort? If it was the latter, I let it go. This was the moment when I stopped reacting and started directing, quietly, methodically, without announcement. And no one noticed the shift, because they still believed I would adapt. They didn't yet understand that the version of me who did that was already gone. Once the decision was made, everything became simpler. Not easier, but clearer. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't need to justify the pace or the direction of my actions. I just needed to move. And I did, quietly. I began taking steps that, on their own, looked ordinary, routine, administrative, but together they formed a deliberate shift away from the life I had been unconsciously maintaining for someone else. I followed the processes carefully. I asked precise questions. I made sure I understood timelines, obligations, and consequences before committing to anything. I didn't rush, not because I was hesitant, but because accuracy mattered more than speed. To anyone watching from the outside, it probably looked like I was cooperating, complying, going along with the momentum that had already been set in motion. And in a narrow sense, that was true. What they didn't see was that I was no longer moving with the current. I was moving through it. I handled my responsibilities efficiently, but I stopped absorbing more than was necessary. I stopped smoothing over uncertainties that weren't mine to resolve. I let other people encounter the friction they had been shielded from for years. No announcements were made, no lines were drawn. I simply redirected my energy. My husband continued operating under the assumption that I would adapt as I always had. He spoke in terms of fairness and closure, as if the emotional chapter had already been finalized. I let him believe that, because at this stage, belief worked in my favor. Every step I took was legal, measured, intentional. There were no dramatic gestures, no emotional appeals, just decisions made with full awareness of their long-term implications. What surprised me most was how invisible this process was to others. People often expect transformation to be loud. They expect signs, anger, distance, declarations. They don't expect quiet precision. I maintained my composure not as a mask, but as a boundary. I didn't owe anyone access to my internal process, especially not people who had already made decisions without me. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means choosing not to narrate your life to people who are no longer entitled to the draft. And as I continued forward step by step, I could feel the structure of my life shifting beneath the surface, realigning around my needs instead of my availability. The consequences of that realignment hadn't arrived yet, but they were already inevitable. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They emerge in fragments, small disruptions that don't immediately announce their source. At first, they feel like an inconvenience, confusion, a subtle sense that something familiar is no longer functioning the way it used to. That's how it began for everyone else. Things that had always run smoothly started requiring attention. Details that had once been handled quietly now demanded discussion. Schedules didn't align as effortlessly. Assumptions met resistance, not through argument, but through absence. I didn't point this out. I didn't highlight the changes. I simply stopped compensating for them. My husband noticed, though not immediately. At first, he seemed mildly unsettled, as if something was off but not urgent enough to name. He asked a few clarifying questions. I answered them factually, without offering extra context. I wasn't being distant. I was being precise. What unsettled him wasn't my behavior. It was the lack of access. He was used to moving through decisions with my silent support, my anticipatory adjustments. Now he had to account for variables he had never managed himself. And because I wasn't reacting emotionally, there was nothing to argue with. No conflict to resolve, just a growing awareness that the structure he relied on had shifted. Others felt it too. Not dramatically, just enough to notice that things were taking longer. Certain processes required more effort. That the ease they had come to expect wasn't guaranteed anymore. No one accused me of anything. They couldn't. I hadn't withdrawn out of spite. I hadn't broken any agreements. I had simply stopped overextending. That's the part people don't prepare for. What happens when the person who holds things together stops doing more than their share? The absence becomes visible before the labor ever was. My husband grew increasingly restless. He tried to reestablish familiar rhythms to engage me the way he always had. I responded politely, neutrally, without re-entering the role he expected. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was living inside the boundaries I should have had all along. And slowly, the implications began to register. Decisions were no longer seamless. Outcomes required negotiation. The illusion of unilateral control began to fracture, not because I challenged it directly, but because I was no longer supporting it invisibly. Still, no one fully understood what was happening. They just knew that something essential was missing, and for the first time, it wasn't me. By the time the urgency surfaced, it was already misdirected. My husband didn't suddenly become reflective. He didn't come to me with remorse or insight. What arrived instead was a subtle form of panic masked as practicality, a sense that something had gone off script and that it needed to be corrected quickly. He started asking questions he had never asked before. Not about my feelings, but about outcomes. About timing, about whether certain things could still be worked out. I recognized the shift immediately. This wasn't regret, it was destabilization. For the first time, he was encountering consequences that couldn't be managed with efficiency alone. The systems he had relied on, systems I had quietly maintained, were no longer operating automatically. And because he had never fully seen my role in them, he didn't know how to restore them. He tried, in his own way. He spoke more, checked in more frequently, used phrases like, "Maybe we should talk, and we can figure this out." But the conversation stayed on the surface, focused on restoring equilibrium, not understanding why it had been disrupted. That's when I realized something important. Even now, he didn't see me. He saw a problem that needed to be stabilized. The timing mattered. If this awareness had arrived earlier, before decisions were finalized, before paths were chosen, it might have opened space for something different, but awareness that arrives only after loss is rarely about connection. It's about control. I listened to him with the same calm I had always offered. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't confront him with everything I now understood, because there was no need. The window for repair had closed, not because I was unwilling, but because the foundation for mutuality had never been built. You can't fix what was never acknowledged. I could feel his confusion growing. The absence of emotional escalation unsettled him more than anger would have. He expected resistance or accommodation. What he encountered instead was neutrality. And neutrality, when someone expects access, feels like distance. He asked if I was angry. I told him the truth. No. Anger would have meant I was still negotiating, still hoping, still invested in a version of the relationship that required my erasure. What I felt instead was finality. Not bitterness, not resentment. Just the quiet understanding that the version of me who would have tried to save this had already outgrown the role. By the time he sensed that something couldn't be undone, it was already too late to fix it, because nothing was broken in the moment. It had simply ended. And endings that arrive without conversation don't reopen easily. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. There was no raised voice. No list of grievances was laid out like evidence. No emotional release waiting to be triggered. Just two people sitting across from each other, acknowledging what had already taken shape. He asked me, calmly, almost carefully, when I had decided. I took a moment before answering, not to compose myself, but to be precise. I didn't decide all at once, I said. I noticed. That seemed to confuse him. I explained simply that I had spent a long time adapting, that I had learned to make space where there wasn't any offered, that I had accepted conclusions instead of participating in conversations. And that was when the decision to divorce arrived without discussion. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confirmation. He listened, nodded, asked a few clarifying questions, but even then, the focus drifted toward outcomes. What would happen next? How things would look? What could still be managed smoothly? I didn't correct him. I told him I wasn't angry, that I didn't need explanations anymore, that I wasn't trying to punish him or make a point. I was just no longer willing to live inside a structure where my presence was optional. There was a long pause after that. In that silence, I could see him trying to locate the version of me he was used to, the one who would reassure him, soften the moment, offer understanding. That version didn't appear. Instead, there was I, calm, grounded, unavailable for negotiation. This wasn't dominance through control. It was clarity through boundaries. I didn't raise my voice because there was nothing left to defend. I didn't demand acknowledgement because I no longer needed it to move forward. The conversation wasn't about resolution. It was about closure. He asked if there was anything he could do differently. I told him the truth again. Not now. That wasn't cruelty. It was timing. When conversations arrive after decisions, they don't function as a repair. They function as reassurance for the person who made the choice. And I wasn't responsible for providing that anymore. We ended the conversation politely, respectfully, without illusion. I walked away from it without adrenaline, without sadness, without triumph, just certainty. And that certainty stayed with me. Who I am now is not a reaction, it's a correction. That distinction matters to me because for a long time my life was shaped by reaction, by adjustment, by anticipation, by the quiet habit of moving in response to other people's expectations. I didn't notice how much of myself was organized around not disrupting, around keeping things stable, being the person others could rely on without ever having to look too closely. Today, that orientation is gone. I am still calm, still composed, still observant. But my calm is no longer an offering. It's no longer something I give away to maintain balance in systems that don't include me fully. It belongs to me now. What changed most wasn't my personality, it was my internal reference point. I no longer measure my worth by how well things function around me. I no longer feel responsible for smoothing discomfort that isn't mine to resolve. And I no longer confuse being adaptable with being valued. For years, I believed that love meant flexibility, that maturity meant restraint, that strength meant absorbing more than my share quietly. I believed that if I stayed calm long enough, attentive enough, and useful enough, connection would naturally follow. It didn't, and that realization didn't harden me. It clarified me. I trust my perceptions now in a way I didn't before. When something feels off, I don't immediately search for ways to rationalize it. I don't assume the discomfort is my own misunderstanding. I pause. I observe. And if clarity doesn't arrive through mutual engagement, I step back instead of stepping in harder. This is new for me. Before, stepping back felt like failure, like withdrawal, like giving up too early. Now I understand it as discernment. I've learned that not every silence needs to be filled, and not every gap is mine to close. I also understand, finally, that being easy is not the same as being safe, and being safe is not the same as being chosen. There is a version of me that no longer exists. The woman who preemptively minimized herself to preserve harmony. The woman who translated her needs into something more convenient for others. The woman who believed that if she didn't ask for much, she would be appreciated for it. She wasn't weak. She was sincere, but she was operating under assumptions that no longer serve me. Who I am now is someone who waits to see how people show up before offering depth. Someone who listens for reciprocity, not just consistency. Someone who understands that emotional access is not a right, it's a privilege that's earned through presence and accountability. This hasn't made me colder. If anything, it's made me more precise with my warmth. I don't over-explain myself anymore. Not because I'm guarded, but because clarity doesn't require persuasion. When something matters to me, I state it plainly. When it doesn't, I don't manufacture importance to seem agreeable. I've also stopped trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding me. That shift alone changed everything. In practical terms, my life looks quieter now, but more intentional. I make decisions with myself in mind, not as an afterthought. I ask different questions. I allow more space between stimulus and response. I no longer rush to reassure people when they're unsettled by my boundaries. Their discomfort is not my emergency. This doesn't mean I'm unkind. It means I'm no longer available for roles that require my disappearance. People respond to me differently now. Some with genuine respect, because clarity invites respect. Some with confusion, because they were attached to an earlier version of me. A few with distance, because boundaries reveal who was benefiting from your lack of them. I let all of that happen without commentary. I've learned that you don't need to defend a life that finally fits you. One of the most subtle but profound changes is how I relate to silence. Silence used to be something I endured, something that signaled uncertainty or emotional distance. Now it's something I use intentionally. I don't fill space to be liked. I don't speak to manage reactions. I speak when there is something true to say. And when there isn't, I remain still without apology. I no longer wait to be chosen by a partner, by a system, by a narrative that tells women they must earn visibility through sacrifice. I choose myself quietly, consistently, without announcement. That doesn't mean I've closed myself off from connection. It means I no longer chase it at the cost of self-erasure. If someone wants access to me now, they meet me where I am, not where I used to bend. The ending of my marriage didn't teach me to distrust people. It taught me to pay attention. It taught me that clarity is kinder than accommodation, and that self-respect doesn't need an audience to be real. I didn't rebuild myself out of spite. I didn't reinvent myself out of anger. I realigned. And in that alignment, I became visible to myself first. That is who I am now. There is a particular quiet that comes after something truly ends. Not the hollow kind, and not the kind filled with regret, but the kind that feels complete. Like a room that has finally been cleared of furniture, you learn to walk around for years. That's where this story settles. Not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in understanding. For a long time, I believed that endings were loud, that they required explanations, arguments, and emotional reckoning. I believed closure was something you received from another person, something granted after enough conversation, remorse, or acknowledgement. I know now that this isn't always true. Some endings arrive without conversation, and that doesn't make them invalid. It makes them revealing. What my marriage taught me, slowly, quietly, and then all at once, is that absence of conflict is not the same as presence of care. That reliability, when taken for granted, becomes a form of erasure. And that silence, when unexamined, can turn into a place where other people make decisions for you. This story was never about divorce. It was about visibility, about what happens when a woman is valued for how little she asks for, how well she adapts, how seamlessly she carries weight, about how easy it is to disappear inside a role that rewards quiet endurance while bypassing mutual engagement. I don't regret the woman I was. She survived with grace. She kept things steady when they could have collapsed. She believed in patience and loyalty because she meant them sincerely. But I also don't romanticize her silence anymore, because silence is only powerful when it is chosen. The moral of this story isn't leave sooner or fight harder. It's simpler and harder than that. Pay attention to patterns before they finalize into outcomes. Notice who includes you in decisions and who assumes you will adapt afterward. Understand that being calm does not obligate you to be invisible. You are allowed to require conversation. You are allowed to require presence. You are allowed to step away from systems that function because you disappear inside them. And if someone decided your future without your voice, that tells you everything you need to know about how they saw your place in it. I didn't win anything by staying quiet at the end. I didn't lose anything by refusing to perform closure for someone else's comfort. What I gained was authorship. And authorship, I've learned, is the most peaceful form of power there is. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the dependable one, the quiet one, the person everyone assumed would be fine, I want to leave you with one final open question. Have you ever realized that your silence was being mistaken for consent? And what did you do when you finally saw it? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.